Hello everyone, GoldenNova here. A while back, I released an episode talking about the cards that use ice counters. Now, I found out that the ice counter cards were actually tied in with Alexis's manga cards, so I ended up covering those as well. But I found myself walking away being very disappointed with how ice counters were handled in the actual game. Now, granted, these released relatively early in Yu-Gi-Oh's development. It seems weird to say that about Zexal era cards, but this game is old now, and I feel like my bones are rotting every second I play it. But Yu-Gi-Oh's never really been good with counters even nowadays. It's barely good at it with archetypes that actually care about using them, like spell counters or predator counters. So I figured this was a great opportunity to ask all of you for your great custom card brewing skills. For those not in the know, I used to fairly regularly cover my patrons' custom cards. And I'm gonna be honest, I've kind of missed doing that. So I decided to shake off the rust, and now I'm gonna go through some of the most interesting examples that all of you submitted in the comments during that video. I do want to say though, even if your card doesn't make it into this video, I'm still very appreciative that you took the time to share your ideas and put them out there into the world. That takes a lot of courage, and it means a lot to me that you would share it over here on the Orbital platform. So, to wet our whistle, I want to go over a couple of, not cards, but ideas that were shared in the comments that I thought were pretty good. The first one came from Nathan Vig 4401, a Max C style hand trap that would put ice counters on monsters when summoned, and a couple of other things, maybe making it so monsters with ice counters on them could only be used for the summon of water monsters for things like fusions or link summons or what have you. Now, they name-dropped Max C, but I'm also sensing a little bit of planet pollutant virus as well. Now, I love aliens. In fact, I love them so much, I want to share this video with you. Check the finals, you might find something pretty funny. And honestly, I think it's great, especially with how low-powered the ice counter cards are. Giving them a way to just spread out counters like there's no tomorrow off of a hand trap effect seems like a pretty good way to not make them competitive, but to at least make it feel like the ice counters are doing something. Bam Starful went in kind of an opposite but similar energy direction. A field or continuous spell card that adds ice counters to itself while also providing other effects, maybe negating attacks, other effects, or even debuffing attack based on the amount of ice counters that are on the field, which that last one is kind of the most in line with what's already established, but I could see you cashing in a certain amount of counters to achieve certain other effects. It's also nice to have a way to bank ice counters on cards that aren't monsters. Something I mentioned previously is that the ice counter cards are actually full of non-bows, Snowdust Dragon being the biggest one, because it stops all monsters with ice counters on them from attacking or changing battle position, not just your opponents. So that means you don't want to put them on your monsters to prevent that, but for the ones that care about having as many ice counters on the field as possible, you don't want to put them on your opponent because you're just gonna lose them. A battery card like Bam Starful is suggesting would go a long way towards allowing you to benefit from ice counters while still making it safe to put them on your opponent to occasionally ruin their day. But that's all the hypothetical cards we're going to talk about today. Now, we have some actual card design going on here. In no particular order, we have Fear Junkie's Icebound Snowplains, a field spell card that, if activated, has you adding a card from your deck to your hand that mentions ice counters except a copy of Icebound Snowplains. You can only use this effect of Icebound Snowplains once per turn, and while on the field, monsters you control with ice counters on them gain 500 attack, though not for each ice counter, and monsters your opponent controls with ice counters on them can't attack, change battle positions, and their effects can't be activated. And if you or an opponent normal or special summon a fire monster, destroy this card. I agree with their musings at the end that this probably wouldn't be included in an actual version of the card, though it does add a lot of flavor. You would expect fire to melt anything made out of ice. It's a big flavor win, but it does make it effectively unusable, even in formats that aren't being run by fire attribute monsters as we've seen in recent months and or years. Any generic fire attribute link monster just shuts this off entirely, which kinda sucks. That being said, it's very powerful. Its third effect is basically a better Snowdust Dragon, effectively cutting that monster out of the brew entirely. It covers the attack locking, the position changing, and also stops effects from being activated. It even benefits you for putting ice counters on your own monsters by giving you that 500 point boost, which I think is fairly reasonable. My only complaint here is that normally field spells like this say you can only activate a copy of this card once per turn, not you can only use the effect on activation once per turn. So yeah, overall really solid card, and aside from the teeny problem-solving card text tweaking, the only problem I have with it is that it takes one of our boss monsters and just cuts it out of the theme entirely, which I feel shouldn't be what Legacy support is here to do, even though this does make ice counters infinitely more playable. Now, a non-Echo 98 basically made their own wave of legacy support. There are so many cards you could actually fill out a section of a core set with this. We're not going to cover all of them, but there were some highlights I really liked. Glacier Empress is a water attribute, level 8 spellcaster monster with 2900 attack and 2400 defense that you can special summon from your hand if you control 2 or more level 5 or higher monsters that mention ice counters in their text. The effects of face-up cards your opponent controls with ice counters on them are negated, and once per turn, as a quick effect, you can remove a number of ice counters from anywhere on the field to place that amount of ice counters on face-up cards on the field. This one leans really hard into ice counters, and I love the commitment to the bit. While you can summon Glacier Empress in any way, if you have Ice Master and Snowdust Dragon on the board, you can just hop them out of the hand for free. Then, Master can go ahead and make ice counters for you, and Empress can move them around. In fact, the moving around part is probably my favorite. It's another way to help conserve ice counters between cards. I'm also sensing vibes of Dragos Tapalia. While we're not making a counter to negate a card, we can take from one and put it on another at quick effect speed to apply the continuous negation. But this hits cards, not just monsters. This gives us ways to deal with things like continuous spells, field spells, continuous trap cards, that kind of stuff. I wonder how this would interact with normal spell and trap cards. I mean, they are on the field, and at quick speed you could move a counter onto them, though I guess I'm not sure if there's some kind of special rule about the fact that normal spell and traps kind of leave the field immediately that would keep counters from going on them. Is there any rules precedence for this? I'm very curious. Anyway, really solid boss monster, but I am finding a different way to summon this because committing all of those to the field seems like a huge hassle, only to follow up with Glacial. Frost Tiger has a lot more momentum. It's a level 4 water spellcaster monster with 1900 attack and 1300 defense. Seems weird that the Tiger is a spellcaster, but we're trying to keep to the water spellcastering theming, so I'm glad they decided to do that. If this card battles an opponent's monster, you place an ice counter on your opponent's battling monster, and then also adds the A counter effect, this strange parenthetical that shows that while the counter itself doesn't have the effect, you're going to apply this whenever ice counters are involved. In this case, it causes a 300 attack and defense debuff for each counter on it if that monster with an ice counter battles a water monster. Very interesting choice there. If this card destroys a monster with ice counters on it, you can special summon a level 4 or lower water monster that mentions ice counters in its text. It doesn't mention from where, but considering this feels like Flamvel Fire Dog, it's probably supposed to summon from the deck, which would be the best. This effectively means that Tiger has 2200 attack because most anything it fights will have its attack debuffed by 300. And when it wins by battle, you can summon another Frost Tiger with this because this does not say you can't summon another copy of this card. Now, you can only use that effect once per turn, so you can't go for a third Frost Tiger or really any ice counter monster, but it does ensure you have 2 level 4 water monsters on the board, and I have seen terrifying things from decks that have 2 level 4 water monsters on them. Sharks. This is a pretty good advantage generator card, but let's just say that Flamvel Fire Dog doesn't see competitive success nowadays for a reason. Effects that only trigger during the battle phase are too slow and not impactful enough. Your starter's gotta be setting up a bigger board than this. But if Frost Tiger was printed back during the 5Ds era, it would go brazy, mark my words. Their last contribution is a field spell called Frozen Palace of the Sweeping Tundra. When this card is activated, you add a water spell caster or a card that mentions ice counters in its text from your deck to your hand. Your opponent's monsters with ice counters on them lose 300 attack and defense for each ice counter on them and cannot change position. And if any number of cards with ice counters on them are destroyed, you distribute the ice counters among face-up cards, which is another good way to help ensure that our ice counter count remains high. The debuff effect stacks with apparently the one that we get from Frost Tiger, which is pretty nice. And it has the classic field spell search effect. What more could you want? Honestly, I'm surprised there wasn't a Link 1 that searches the field spell. Aside from the counter distribution effect, this is a pretty bog standard field spell, but I wouldn't call that a knock against it. Ice counter needs all the help it can get, and if that help comes in the form of a standardized field spell that helps the consistency of the deck while boosting its game plan, I'm all for it. And hey, they have the correct problem-solving card text for the field spell. That's a plus. Next up, we have a couple of cards that were submitted by longtime Discord mod Captain Blitz. They had an interesting angle on this, trying to play into Alexis's ritual strategies from the anime. Snowstorm Ritual is a quick play spell card that can be used to ritual summon Snowstorm Angel from your hand or graveyard. You must also tribute monsters from either side of the field with ice counters whose total amount of ice counters equal the monster's level. You can also banish this card from your hand or grave and to destroy a monster you control or in your hand to place ice counters on monsters on either side of the field equal to that destroyed monster's level. So while we don't know anything about the ritual monster proper, we do know that this card itself is devastating. Bit of a spoiler here, but because you check to see how many ice counters are being removed on the monsters being tributed and not those monsters' level, you could put one ice counter on 4 of your opponent's monsters and tribute them all at quick effect speed. That's bonkers. And then, should you ever need a quick way to generate ice counters, you can banish this while destroying any monster that you control or that's in your hand to distribute those counters. This does put Snowstorm Ritual in an interesting position where it has an effect in the hand that does not involve actually activating the spell card itself. If you banish Snowstorm Ritual from the hand, it's an effect that activated in there, but you didn't activate the spell card itself, just its effect. It's kind of similar to activating the effect of a spell card while in the graveyard. Once again, don't think there's any precedence for this one, but I don't think it's out of the question. Though it does mean that that effect bypasses any cards that negate spell card activations, just spell effect activations. And you can summon the ritual monster from the graveyard, so you are never safe, barring any kind of dimension shifter nonsense. But because this is a quick play spell card, this does mean that we have lost any way to use pre-preparation of rites, so I guess it's kind of balanced. Speaking of which, we've got to take a look at that ritual monster, Snowstorm Angel, a level 4 water spellcaster ritual monster with 2400 attack and 1000 defense, which I'm sure is only there just to get me to say, ooh, Monarch stats, which I'm not going to pass up the opportunity to do. It must be ritual summoned with Snowstorm Ritual and gains 200 attack for each ice counter on the field. Monsters you control with ice counters are unaffected by monster effects except their own, and this monster can attack every monster your opponent controls with an ice counter once each. And if this card is destroyed, special summon a water monster from either player's graveyard. That last effect kind of ties in with our ritual spell's final effect, because if we destroy a big water monster, then Snowstorm Angel gets us back a big honking of a chonker. Its attack gain effect is pretty good considering its stat line is already pretty good at base, but the blanket monster effect protection is really good because the way it's worded does mean that you can have Snowdust Dragon on your field and give your monsters ice counters and make sure that Snowdust Dragon does not interfere with them because all of your monsters are immune to all of your other monsters' effects, while still gaining protection from your opponent's monsters. And then it just punches a whole bunch, like it just a lot of punching. Susanoo was calling, it wants its calling card back. Combine this with our ritual spell, which is basically just removal, and you've got yourself a pretty heavy hitter, even if by doing so you do rob yourself of the attack targets that make the multi-attack so deadly. So in that regard, it's carrying on the spirit of Alexis's anime cards quite well. Ronaldi Hain joins the pantheon of names online that I have difficulty pronouncing, and I'm very sorry if this doesn't come out right, produces Absolute Zero Barrier, a field spell card that says that all water monsters with ice counters on the field cannot be destroyed by card effects. Also, all non-water monsters with ice counters on the field cannot attack and lose 500 attack. Your Snowdust Dragons gain 500 attack for each monster you control with ice counters on them, and can attack a number of times each battle phase up to the number of monsters you control with ice counters. Once per turn, you can destroy one other card you control or in your hand, and if you do, add from your deck to your hand one Snowdust Dragon, or one card that has an effect that places ice counters. Now this one goes absolutely wild with it. See, my complaint was that if you have Snowdust Dragon and a bunch of other monsters, putting ice counters on them disables them. Absolute Zero Barrier here decides to flip that on its head by making any potential attack from those monsters Snowdust Dragon's attacks. Not only are you gaining a crisp 500 attack on that monster for each one, it also gains an unrestricted attack, not on monsters, so you gather enough companions on board and you are cutting in for game. It also helps protect all of your creatures from card effect destruction. Even Snowdust Dragon, because thankfully its effect says that it keeps other monsters with ice counters on them from attacking. A lot of the cards submitted tried to find funny ways to get around Snowdust Dragon's weird non-bow, but Ronaldi here dug their heels in and said, no, this is actually how it's supposed to work. My giant dragon is supposed to be the centerpiece of my strategy, and I will feed my monsters to it to ensure I gain victory. And honestly, as a dragon lover, based. Midcore Gamer 7625 presents Snowdust Chill Dragon, a level 8 water dragon monster with 2800 attack and 1800 defense that you can special summon from your hand by removing 4 ice counters from anywhere on the field. And monsters that have ice counters on them gain the following effects depending on their controller. If you control them, that monster gains 400 attack for each ice counter on it, and once per turn, if this monster's attribute is water, you can place an ice counter on a monster your opponent controls, thus turning monsters with ice counters on them into ice counter generators if they're on theme. If your opponent controls them, this card loses 400 attack for each ice counter on it, and if this monster's attribute is not water, its activated effects cannot be activated. This is probably the coolest way to handle a Snowdust Dragon retrain. By giving the effects based on control, the ice counters take on this weird modular function, and it certainly helps that by putting ice counters on your cards, it enables you to put ice counters on your opponent's cards as well, which is pretty neat. Now, that's all the ice counter cards I wanted to talk about today, but there is one more that I felt required a spotlight. The Wizard Moose, one of the longest supporters of the channel, introduces Counting Counters, a continuous spell card that, when activated, lets you add a monster from your deck to your hand that adds counters to cards on the field, which is already a huge boon to any Endymion deck. You can remove any number of counters from one card you control to add the same number of counters to this card, and you can target one card on the field to remove any number of counters from this card to add the same number of counters to that target. You can remove 3 counters from this card to add a counter card from your deck to your hand, and you can only control one type of counter while this card is on the field. A restriction that I presume is there to keep you from just grabbing all the best counter-producing cards and making counter turbo. This card is pretty funny. I assume that when it says it takes a counter from one card and places it on this one, and then it takes it from this card and puts it on another, that it also means that it's the same kind of counter. Unfortunately, while we do have a variety of counters with different names attached to them, some cards just place counters. And despite the fact that the name is pretty generic, a card that generates a counter does not mean that its counter is compatible with another card that just makes a counter to it. It's weird counter rulings. So presumably you would maintain the type of counter that it is whenever you move them around. But honestly, being able to move that stuff around is pretty cool, though we would have to figure out exactly how that interacts with things like predator counters, which have that applied effect on top of it. Does it also reapply the effect to the moved card if it's an applicable monster, even though this effect doesn't have the parenthetical text like the predator counter applying effects do? We're in the realm of custom cards, so I'm going to say that it just works, but if these were real, what would we have to do to ensure that? And then I guess we just have a counter card searcher just because it's funny. But the fact that you can take any deck that generates any kind of counters and convert them into a counter card, notably not a counter trap, a card with counter in the name, it seems very funny, and I think we should have more stuff like this. And that's all we got here. I know I didn't Nova scale any of these, but I didn't tell you I was going to Nova scale them. I didn't want you to share your ideas and then all of a sudden be hit by a numerical grade. And to be fair, they're all based on ice counters, so you would get a 0 in novelty for all of them. But it was fun taking a look at it. Being able to focus on what was interesting about the card and how it applied to existing design is always something I'm down for, and I'd love to hear if you'd like to see more of the same. Did you like the format? Is there anything different you'd like to see? And are there any other custom card topics that you'd like to see covered in the future? And of course, if you haven't already, it would mean the world to me if you would like the video if you liked it, subscribe if you haven't already, and share this around with any other Yu-Gi-Oh players or custom card crafters that you know who might like this video. We are now entering the post-holiday season, and that means things get rough for basically all your favorite YouTubers. So any extra support that you can provide, ranging from the free stuff of just sharing this around, to direct support with the links below, means a lot to all of us. In fact, today's episode is brought to you by Dragon Shield. Get the sleeves as strong as dragon scales and get 5% off your order by using the coupon code GoldenNova at checkout. It was also brought to you by my lovely patrons, including this month's illustrious Quasar Commanders Upstairs Media and the Critic of Innocence, Nebula Navigator's Third Dynasty, 50 Gigabytes, Ada Basilisk, Adam Zagidel, Ancient Wizard, Andrew Newman, Battle Axe, Kane Senpai, Chibi Gohan, Christopher Fuss, Clockswork, Comrade Copperbottom, Eric, Frankie, Garland Chaos, Going It/Its for the Bit/Bits, Great Big Pillock, Hair Bear, Happy Majin, Harry the Ominous Benefactor, Iron Zero, Iskander 711, Carp, Marion James E. Picata, Millennia Asta, Muse Clark, Neon Yami Nair, Orozco 09096, Panther J, Bat Boos, Rank 10 Trains, Rebel King Lucifer, Red Eyes Jackalow, RJ the Jank Monarch, Thievery Coast and the Wizard Moose, Cosmic Crusaders Ally Vatnia, Animasta, Baron Von Tete Sprinkles, Beelzephyr, Fish, Beluga Masta, Blitzwolf, Caesar M, Chazghost, Dr. Reaper, RIP, Eva Padilla, Garylick Bread, Hike Boyagian, Herbal D, Inblink, Kale the Dragon, Lobomaru 02, Manga Pages, Matt Simmons, McSpoofy, Natiel Lee Alexander, Nitromo, Not Al Gore, Nyx, Obsidian, Rainer Leong, Ryan Kairos, Shizuka Nijimura, Sir Knight JCB, Sophie, apparently, Sphilia, Stephen Williamson, The Legendary Raven, The Phantom Knights of Shitted Pants, The Gene, Tiger X2476, Weasel King of Weaseltown and Zal Dreka, as well as all the wonderful Starlight Explorers you see on screen now. If you'd like to help me in my journey to cover all of Yu-Gi-Oh's archetypes, get my videos early, be a part of these credits and other awesome perks, it would mean the world to me if you would check out the link to my Patreon in the description or consider joining as a YouTube member. And if you'd like to see another example of me covering custom cards, here's an older video from one of my first custom card reviews. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.